Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our continuing series of classes from the Sandy Granite Family History Center. Tonight, we have a real live wire with us tonight. Catherine Grant, and a lot of you have probably seen Catherine at other events. She has presented at, of course, with the BYU Family History Library, a lot of presentations there for them, and you can go online to that website and check out her presentations that she's done. Gosh, she's done so many things. She has actually been a writer, had a column in the Nauvoo. What was the Nauvoo? What?
Nauvoo Times?
That's right, the Nauvoo Times. I almost forgot that. And she's a writer. She does all kinds of stuff. And she's been a genealogist for quite some time. And she gives the most interesting presentations. So you're going to love this. This is going to be really good. How's that? You think that's good?
That is one of the nicest introductions I've ever gotten, Bob. Thank you. That is very gracious.
That just proves that $20 goes a long way.
That's true. I was afraid you were going to charge me more, but yeah, if the 20 got that, I'm totally good with it.
We'll see. But anyway, you should have on your screen the title of tonight's presentation, Understanding Intended Identity. And it's really good stuff, basic stuff that we need to know to keep the tree clean and keep it washed out, so to speak, whatnot. So if you have questions, you can put them in chat. I'll be monitoring the chat, or you can ask at the end of the presentation. We'll stay on for a while for questions. This presentation, like all of our classes, will be available in a couple of days on our website, and I'll put the website in the chat, www.granitefhc.com, and you can go there and view it 24/7, 365. And Catherine has done some other presentations for us, and they are archived on there as well. So without further ado, Catherine.
Thank you, Bob. I'm so happy to be with you guys, both those of you who are watching live tonight and anybody else who's watching this later. This topic is a fairly new one for me. It took me many years to figure this out, and I'm hoping, but it's been incredibly helpful to me. So I'm hoping that by sharing this with you, it will also be helpful to you. So what's on the docket for tonight? First of all, we will talk about what is intended identity. What does that term even mean? Why is it important? How do you determine it? And then we're going to walk through 4 examples of determining intended identity. I did want to make a quick comment about the scope of tonight's class. Even though the title said it's the key to fixing sticky problems, it is, but this webinar is not going to focus on actually fixing the sticky problems. We do not have enough time for that for this particular webinar. It will show how knowing a person's intended identity makes it easier to fix problems correctly. And if you'd like to learn more about the actual steps involved in fixing a sticky problem, I would recommend probably searching YouTube or Googling for fixing sticky problems in Family Tree, and it should come up in one of the earliest results, the link to the video. So let's dive into our first topic tonight. What exactly is intended identity? Well, when somebody creates a person's profile in Family Tree, they intend it to represent a certain human being. That is the intended identity. So, for example, here is a snapshot of my second great-grandfather's person page in Family Tree. And here's his PID. It ends in BPR. And this profile, as we look over it, we see that it was intended to represent a person with the following characteristics. He was named Joseph Aminadab Quibell. He was born in 1844 in Navanby, Lincolnshire. He was married to Rebecca Bingham Newton, etc., etc. So these facts establish the identity of a human being in a unique way. And one reason that's important is there's a lot of people with the same name, right? And so we've got to have ways, and especially if people are deceased, which most of the people we work on in Family Tree are, unless we're working particularly on our immediate family. But for deceased people, we don't usually have the benefit of seeing them and distinguishing them by facial characteristics or relationships. We know their wife or something, or occupation. When we're dealing with deceased people, basically we have these certain facts that we use to establish intended identity. And the typical facts that are used are four. So we typically will rely on names, dates, places, and relationships to establish the identity of somebody. Well, you might be thinking that totally sounds like a no-brainer, because if I created that profile in Family Tree, I know which human being I intended them to represent. Plus, can't I tell who they are just by looking at the profile? Well, that works very well in a personal tree, but Family Tree is a shared tree. And so in a shared tree, it's actually not that simple for a couple of reasons. First of all, if we didn't create the profile, we actually don't automatically know the intended identity. In other words, if we don't know the person who created it and we didn't create it ourselves, how do we know what they intended when they first created this person? Not only that, the original intended identity can be changed through edits, incorrect merges, and so forth. In other words, the apparent identity that we see on that profile screen, that profile page, may not match the original intended identity. So that raises the question, why does it matter? I actually had a student ask that in one of our classes, and he wasn't trying to be snarky. He was sincere. It's like, why does it matter if somebody created this record to be Joseph Aminadab Quibell, and I think it should be his cousin, Joseph Quibell, who had the same name, but he's a different person. Why does it matter? Well, let's take a look. So anytime that people participate together in a shared activity, some kind of shared understanding is essential to avoid confusion. So we've got a couple of examples over here on the side. First of all, we have got to have shared rules in order to drive safely, right? We've got speed limits, we've got stop signs, traffic lights, that kind of thing. We've even got which side of the road we drive on, and it's not the same in all countries. But in order for us to drive our cars safely on our public roads, we've got to have some kind of shared understanding. And oftentimes when there are accidents, it's because that shared understanding has been violated. Those rules have been violated. Here's another simple example. Have you ever gone to a country where you did not speak the language? I did as a child. My dad worked for IBM, and so we went to the Netherlands. And I still remember what a shock it was to my young child brain to suddenly be hearing all these sounds of speech around me and not being able to make any sense of them whatsoever. I could tell people were speaking. I saw their lips moving. I heard the sounds, but I could not create meaning from what they were saying. And that was because we didn't have a shared understanding. They were speaking Dutch. I didn't know Dutch. I only knew English. So we could not communicate until one or the other of us had the shared understanding, either of Dutch or English, so that we could speak intelligibly to each other. Well, the same thing is true in Family Tree. In order to collaborate in any meaningful way in a shared tree, we've got to be able to agree on which human being any given profile represents. So let's look at an example, and this is an actual example from Family Tree. What happens when users have different opinions on which human being? So over here we have the first user. We're looking at profile ending in CKX. The guy's name is Francis Bescaby, and he's christened in 1734 in Cranwell, Lincolnshire, England. So this user thinks that this profile has this intended identity. But this one comes along and he thinks that there's a guy named Francis Bescaby who's actually born a few years later in the parish of Harmston. Well, They both have their different opinions, and this is the trouble with not having a consistent intended identity. You end up with a person with confusing or conflicting information. So notice that one user thought it was for the guy born in 1737 in Cranwell, but the other user thought it was this person christened in Harmston 4 years earlier. Is that right? No, 3 years earlier. Math is not my strong suit, but I think I can handle that simple math. So 3 years earlier. So by looking at this page, we actually don't know which human being the profile represents. When we don't consider intended identity, we can end up with conflicting information as we see here, uncertain identities, and even hidden identities in the case of incorrect merges. Without knowing the intended identity of a profile, honestly, we're building on shifting sand because we can't really tell which vital information is right, which family members really belong, which sources apply, and if there are merges which are correct and incorrect, because we've got to have some reliable baseline for measuring all those other things, to measure all those other things against. We need to know who the person was meant to be so that we can tell if all the other information is about that person. So I would like to offer a simple principle that has helped me as far as intended identity. And that is that the identity at the time the profile was created should take precedence. So in the case of Francis Bescaby, we would want to know what that profile was when he was created and how and if it changed later. And that way we would know which the original identity was and whether or not the changes in the future were correct, or the changes later in the change log. I'm getting ahead of myself. We'll be looking at that. So that leads to the next question. How do I determine a person's intended identity in family tree? Well, the best way to do it that I know of, like we said, the information on the person page on the surface is not always reliable because it could have been changed. So I found the best way to determine the original intended identity of somebody in Family Tree is to go into the change log and look at the earliest information. So if you're wondering how to get to the change log, if you're on the person page, and some of you might be using the new person page, but it's basically in the same location. Look for the box that says latest changes, and it will show the 3 most recent changes. And then at the bottom of that box, there's going to be a link that says show all. And when you click that link, you get taken into the change log. So let's look at some examples. Okay, this first example is for the profile with the ID of GX6VNXZ. So we have scrolled to the bottom of the change log here, and we can see key information about this person that establishes their identity. So first of all, the name is Lottie Crossland. Lottie is born about 1884 in Rotherham, Yorkshire. Her dad is George Henry Crossland, and her mother is Catherine Fox. That is enough information to establish her identity as a unique human being, because it's astronomically impossible that there would be two women named Lottie Crossland with all this other information. Something would have had to be different, like the birth year or the birthplace, or maybe the mom's maiden name, whatever. This is generally, with very, very rare exceptions, this is enough information to establish the identity of a person uniquely. Okay, example number 2. This is actually Lottie's mom, Catherine. Again, it's a slam dunk pretty much as far as intended identity. The reason I wanted to bring it up, though, is because of something that we'll see in just a minute. So her name is Catherine Fox. Again, we're down at the bottom of the change log. So the original name that was created for her is Catherine Fox. She's born about 1846 in Stockport, Cheshire. Her dad is Edward. Her mother is Rosie. But notice the contributor over here on the right-hand side, and also the date. Whenever you see a Family Search contributor in 2012, that means that it was brought over from the old system, which ironically was called new.familysearch.org. It's not new anymore. It's old. You can't even get to it. It's been retired. The reason I wanted to point this out is that sometimes people will look at this contributor of Family Search and they'll go, oh, that means that Family Search carefully researched this person and validated them. So all of this is everything that has Family Search on it is completely trustworthy. And that is actually not the case. I was in a presentation once that Ron Tanner gave where he was asked about this, and he gave this explanation. In the old system, new.familysearch.org, you could have seen the contributors of all this information. But when they switched to the current system, Family Tree, they didn't have permission to transfer all the users over. Some users might have been deceased or couldn't get in touch with them or whatever. So because of that possible permission problems with some users, they chose not to bring any users over, which I can understand because it was a privacy risk. So instead, any information imported from new.familysearch.org into the current system, Family Tree, they just stamped it with Family Search as the contributor. So I felt like that was important to clarify, just so that so there's not confusion about the validity of this record. The validity really depends on the contributions that were made in new.familysearch.org. And often you can tell as you look at the record whether whether the facts are valid or not. And by that, I mean, I'm just realizing that may not sound very clear. I guess what I would say is if I see that something has been contributed by Family Search in 2012 and it has conflicts and problems like multiple conflicting parents and so forth, then I know that the information was probably bad. Well, definitely had gotten corrupted in the old system and was just brought over as it was. So I hope that helps. If that explanation isn't clear, please feel free to ask questions and I'll do my best to explain it better. Okay, let's move on to example number 3. This is our buddy Francis. So we are going to see what his original intended identity was when he was created. So we see that he was created in 2018 by this user right here. When she created him with the name Francis Beskerby. Notice the spelling is a little bit different, but back then at this time in England, that honestly was not a big deal because so many of my ancestors at least were illiterate. They didn't have the chance for education. So if they went to go have something done like a christening or a marriage or whatever, they would speak the name and the clergyman would write it down as best he could, just phonetically how it sounded. So we've got Francis Beskerby, probably not a huge deal that it doesn't match the current one. But here we've got his christening. So his original christening was 1734 in Harmston. His original dad was Francis, and Francis Beskerby is a name on my line that gets used over and over again. So it's not too surprising that his dad had the same name as he did. And then his mother is Mary Cock. Notice something really interesting here, that there is no indication of a birth. We've got a christening, which is close, but we don't have any information on a birth. So if you're like me, the next question that came to my mind was, where did that conflicting birth information come from? Well, as I mentioned, the purpose of this webinar is not to get deep into the fixing. So I'll just make the point that as I scrolled up in the changelog, I discovered that later on in 2018, somebody had come in and made a bad merge. And that's where the birth information came from. The reason I know this is a merge, there were other entries in the changelog for this date, but also this reason statement gives it away that the person was doing a merge because they thought the relationships were the same, but it turns out that they actually weren't, as evidenced by the fact that this person was christened before they were born. And I don't know of anybody, any church or anything that does christenings of children like 3 years before they're even born, or how would you know that the child was even going to exist, right? So that was just obviously that birth date was not correct for this merge. So let's look at the last example, and this one we're going to dig in a little bit deeper on determining intended identity. So I want to introduce you to my buddy Samuel Hibbert, and Samuel has the unfortunate distinction in Family Tree of having 13 merges on him. And as I looked at the merges, I was able to determine that he appeared to be a combination. He and his kids appeared, and his wives appeared to be a combination of 4 or 5 different families. The commonality was that they all had the name Samuel Hibbert, and most of them had married someone named Elizabeth. So, but there was so much conflicting information on the page that I knew that some of the merges couldn't have been correct. And so I started going through trying to untangle those merges. And so the first merge I started working on is this one right here. And so I want to illustrate how we can use intended identity to tell whether this merge is really correct. So we've got the survivor, Samuel, ending in R8H, and we've got this other one that was merged into this Samuel ending in 9VW. So let's take a look. We're going to go to the record ending in R8H, and this is a screenshot of the changelog. So let's look at the key information. We see that he was entered in the system as Samuel Hibbert. He was born in 1829, only have England as a place, nothing more specific than that, but we've got a christening record. So he was christened in 1830 in Cheshire, England. Probably he was born in Cheshire, but we don't know for sure. Right now, we're just looking at the information that was used to establish his original intended identity. His parents came in as Mark Hibbert and Mary Bradbury, and he died in 1855. So this is pretty good, right? As far as uniquely identifying information, this established him very well when he was created as this unique person. So let's look at the other guy. This one turns out to be a little trickier. So the guy ending in 9VW came into Family Search in 2012, excuse me, into Family Tree in 2012, contributed by Family Search. So we know he came from the old system, but there are still important clues here. So we see that his name was Samuel Hibbert too. And we see that he came in, notice this is 9VW, he came in as the dad of Samuel Edward Hibbert, born in 1863. That is all that shows in the changelog, but it is enough. It gives us a thread that we can pull on to determine his true, complete identity. One thing that is very helpful is this source right here that was also added in Family Search. And this source, just by way of information, most of the time when you see a source added by Family Search and it's for some kind of church record, usually that was added programmatically because this record was originally based on a church record. If any of you know about the old extraction program, it was kind of the forerunner to the indexing program. Volunteers would go to parish registers or government records and they would transcribe information. Well, this one was a marriage record actually for this guy. And so this Samuel is listed on this record as the father of this boy at the time of his marriage. So that's why there's no vital information, no nothing for him except his relationship to Samuel Edward. So I guess my point about this source is that because Family Search could identify records, family tree information that was based on extracted records, they were able to add these records as a source, and it's highly reliable. The only time it starts getting a little dicey is in the case of bad merges. But this one is way in the beginning. You know, we've scrolled to the bottom of the changelog. We're looking at the original information. So this one I felt very comfortable that this marriage record did actually apply to these people. So with that that information, let's look at what we've got so far. We've got the first Samuel Hibbert with all this information, spouse and children unknown. We've got this other Samuel Hibbert with a lot of unknown information, but at least we've got that he's the dad of this certain individual. Now notice the question at the top of the screen, the question that we want to answer. Oftentimes when somebody's doing a merge, they will frame the question this way. It's kind of automatic. They will say, are these two people the same person? The trouble is that question is very hard to answer because it's so general. We've got to get deeper into all the facts about the person before we can tell if they're the same. What I've noticed is that when people just say, are these two the same people? Then a lot of times they'll rely on the name and possibly the country where they lived and not pay attention to much other information. And that's how bad merges happen, when we rely on very general, broad information without digging deep enough. So the truth is, when we compare these two guys, we don't see any contradictory information, but we also don't see proof one way or another whether these guys are the same. The only information they have in common is their name, and that's not enough. So we can't tell, more research is needed. So again, because this is not a webinar where we're going to dig into the weeds of the actual process of the research, I'm just going to summarize the research that I did. So as I looked at this Samuel Edward Hibbert, because of that unique name, and because he had a dad named Samuel, and his marriage record said that he got married in Lancashire, it was pretty easy to tell who he was in the census. So from the census, I was able to discover that he was born in Gorton, and his dad, who was with him in the census, was born about 1826 in Gorton. Then I used English civil registration to find his mother's maiden name. Of course, in the census, she was listed as Elizabeth Hibbert, but by looking on his birth record and the birth records of the other kids in the census, I could tell that her name was Elizabeth Kay. Well, right here, we've got a little bit of a conflict. We've got 1829 versus 26. And most of the time in England at this time, a child was christened where they were born. So it would be a little unusual for him to be born in Lancashire, but christened in Cheshire. But it's possible. So I still didn't feel that I had enough proof here of whether these guys were the same. So I needed to still do more research. Particularly, I thought it would help to find this guy's parents and also this guy's spouse and possibly the children, if I could. Well, long story short, again, the census came in really handy, and I was ultimately able to determine that this Samuel was the son of a man named John Hibbert and Martha. This guy, according to the census, this Samuel was born in Cheshire, which makes sense given where he was christened. And I found his children in the census. And because of that, I looked up their civil birth registrations and found that the mother's maiden name was Coakley. And indeed, no son named Samuel ever showed up with his family. So with all of this information, we've been able to establish the intended identity of each man. This is the guy born in 1829 in Cheshire, christened in 1830 in Cheshire, his parents, his wife, his kids. This guy was born in 1826 in Gorton. These are his parents, his wife, his kids. So do you see how digging into the intended identity let us really know if these two people were the same person? And as it turns out, they are not, and they should not have been merged. So now I know that I need to undo that merge. So that brings us to the end of our class today on intended identity. And I just want to leave you with a few takeaways, 2 screenfuls worth. Of things that we've covered and things that I hope that we can remember. So the first one is the basic concept of intended identity is that whenever someone creates a profile, they intend it to represent a certain human being. So we'll call that intended identity. And in a personal tree, we take it for granted. It's obvious. We know who we meant that person to be. But in a shared tree, Original intended identity can be changed or lost through wrong edits, bad merges, incorrect relationships, etc. And maintaining the original intended identity reduces confusion and improves accuracy, which actually leads to the next point, which is that knowing that intended identity is a key to avoiding and undoing incorrect merges. So we want to use the earliest information in the change log to determine the intended identity. In other words, as near as we can get it to the information that was used to create that person. Determining, and I want to be really clear on this, I would hate for anybody to go away from this presentation going, Catherine Grant said that this is a family search rule, and excuse me, and we have to do intended identity, and if we're not, we're violating policy or whatever. Absolutely not. I'm sharing this concept of intended identity just because it's helped me so much, but it's not a requirement. It's not a policy. You won't find this in any family search help article or anything like that. Truthfully, it's just another way to be confident that you're doing accurate work in Family Tree. And I'll leave with this final bit of advice, which is if you're thinking about merging two records in Family Tree, but you don't yet know their intended identities, it's better not to merge until you can determine them. I used to think that duplicates were the biggest problem in Family Tree, and they're still a bit of a problem. They can result in confusion and duplicate research. But since I found so many bad merges that I've had to untangle, I've come to the conclusion that bad merges are much worse of a problem. So before you do a merge, be sure to establish that intended identity for both people to make sure whether they should be merged or not. So that brings us to the end of our class today. And Bob, do we have any questions that we need to address?
Nope, I don't see any. Does anyone have any that they would like to ask Catherine? Quiet group.
So either it was completely clear or it was so confusing that people don't even know what to ask.
I found it fascinating because I was thinking back to I always, when I see a merge happening, I get weak kneed, and I don't necessarily know exactly, gee, if I'm going to do this, am I affecting someone's eternal progression? If I
Right.
do this wrong, but this has been
Yeah.
really helpful. Now I know
Oh,
how
good.
systematically how I could go about working
Cool.
and getting it work.
Awesome. That was my hope.
Okay, let's see. Oh, Janet says, thank you so much for this great information. And that's great. And then I posted
Welcome.
over in the chat where you can view this presentation anytime you'd like at www.granitefhc.com. And another one, Janet says too, I love your classes.
That's so sweet. Thank you.
And thanks. That's
That's
you're
me.
okay.
Yeah, I
And
was just
I
answering.
have a question.
Yeah.
This is Robin.
Hi,
And
Robin.
I think I've had a lot of those kinds of things where I've had to look through the change log and try to figure out who the attended identity was. I did never call it that. Thank you
But
for
that's what you did.
a new name.
You're welcome.
But a lot of times I can find that if there are sources attached to either one of them in those original identity things, I can pretty much tell, you did show some sources, but that was a great help too.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, Robin. And the reason that I'm a little leery to rely on sources on the sources tab is that sources can be added through a bad merge or people just connect them incorrectly. And so if the source shows early in the change log, I
Yeah.
feel that it's trustworthy, but later on, like especially, and I know you must have had this experience where you go in and you see 3 1891 censuses attached and they can't all possibly be right because, they're the different areas or whatever. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I agree with you wholeheartedly that the sources are helpful with that little caveat that I try to make sure which sources match the original intended identity. So thank you for bringing that up.
Great, Robin. Thanks. Anyone else have a question? Okay, Catherine, I'm not seeing any more.
Yeah, I'm not either. So
And again, just a reminder, if you'd like to go on to our website and view some of Catherine's other presentations, they're there. And also you can find them at the BYU Family History Library website and the pod there. And then on the screen, of course, is Catherine's contact information.
Yep.
That's there for you as well. So thank you all. And Catherine, thank you so much again for
you're welcome.
being able to be with us again tonight.
It was a
Thank you all,
pleasure.
and good night.
Good night.